Tamara walked briskly down the quiet, tree-lined street, her mind on the work she had just finished at the youth center. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange hue over the city, a city divided in ways that Tamara knew all too well. She had spent the day working with kids from the local community, offering them guidance and hope. But as she walked home, she felt the familiar weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. She had always been proud of her work, helping at-risk youth, giving them the tools they needed to rise above their circumstances. But the small victories didn't make the daily grind any easier. The stares, the whispers, the quick judgments about her presence, they were constant. As she turned a corner, she heard the hum of a squad car pulling up behind her. "Excuse me," a voice called from the driver's side. Tamara stopped in her tracks, a sense of unease immediately creeping in. She knew that voice, Officer Brad Matthews. She turned slowly, her gaze meeting his through the rolled-down window of his squad car. Matthews, a 35-year-old white officer, had always rubbed Tamara the wrong way. His arrogant demeanor, his dismissiveness towards people of color, it was like a badge of honor to him. She had crossed paths with him before, and each encounter left her feeling smaller, invisible. "Can I help you, officer?" Tamara asked, trying to keep her tone even. Matthew's eyes narrowed as he took her in. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone sharp, probing. Tamara's heart skipped a beat. She had expected this, but it still stung. She was on her way home, walking through a neighborhood that, by all appearances, wasn't meant for people like her. "I'm just walking home from the youth center," she replied calmly, gesturing in the direction she had just come. "From Sutkazum, ma'am, I live a few blocks away." "Right," Matthews said, his gaze not leaving her. "And what exactly are you doing in this part of town?" Tamara's stomach clenched. "This is where I work," she said, her patience beginning to thin. "I'm a social worker. I've been helping kids in the community." Matthews's lips curled into a smug smile. "Is that so?" he asked, leaning back in his seat, his eyes still scanning her as if she didn't belong. "You sure you're not just loitering?" Tamara's jaw tightened. "I'm not loitering, officer," she replied, her voice controlled but firm. "I'm walking home. I've done nothing wrong." His eyes narrowed, and his expression hardened. "You know, people like you don't belong in places like this," he muttered, his tone dripping with disdain. Tamara's body went rigid. "What are you implying?" she asked, taking a step closer to his car, her voice growing stronger. She wasn't going to back down this time. "Matthews," scoffed, rolling his eyes. "You heard me! People like you think you can just stroll through here like you own the place." The accusation hung in the air, heavy with the unspoken truth of what he was really saying. Tamara stood there, fists clenched at her sides, her body rigid with frustration. She had heard these things all her life, but somehow, hearing them from someone in a position of power made it sting more than usual. "I belong here just like anyone else," she said, her voice unwavering now, the fire inside her building. "I'm a part of this community. My work, my presence, none of that should be questioned." Matthews sneered, the smug look on his face not wavering. "Sure, whatever you say," he said, still not taking her seriously. "But I'll be keeping an eye on you." He gave a dismissive wave of his hand before speeding off, leaving Tamara standing there, her heart racing, a mixture of anger and exhaustion washing over her. She stood frozen for a moment, the words echoing in her mind. "People like you don't belong here." It wasn't the first time she had been made to feel that way, but today something inside her snapped. Not anymore, she thought. Not anymore. Later that evening, Tamara sat in her small apartment, her mind replaying the encounter with Matthews. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but it felt different. This time the frustration and anger seemed to burn deeper. She had spent so many years trying to rise above the prejudices of others, trying to prove that she was more than what they saw on the surface. But each time she took a step forward, it felt like the world tried to push her back, reminding her of her place. As she sat in the quiet, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text from her friend, Lena. "How are you holding up?" Tamara stared at the message for a few seconds before typing a quick reply. "I'm fine, just tired." Lena knew her better than anyone, and she could hear the exhaustion in her response. She picked up her phone and dialed Lena's number. "Hey," Lena answered on the second ring, her voice warm but laced with concern. "What's going on?" "I had another run-in with Matthews today," Tamara said, rubbing her forehead. She could feel the frustration bubbling up again. "It was bad, Lena. Worse than usual. He treated me like I didn't even matter." "Tamara, I'm so sorry," Lena replied softly. "But you've been strong through all this. You've got so much to offer. Don't let him get to you." Tamara sighed. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. Every day it's the same. I work harder than anyone, and still people like Matthews treat me like I don't belong. Like I'm just a problem to be dealt with." Lena paused. "You know you have a voice, Tamara. Maybe it's time you use it. There's a lot you could change if you keep pushing." Tamara's heart beat a little faster. "You think so?" "I know so," Lena said. "You're stronger than this. You're smarter than all of them. You're making a difference, and you're not doing it alone. I'm with you always." Tamara felt a surge of emotion rise within her, a warmth she hadn't felt in a while. Maybe Lena was right. It was time to stand up, really stand up and be heard, not just for herself but for every person who had been pushed down by the system. Tomorrow things would change. The next morning, Tamara woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. As the sun broke through the clouds, she knew she couldn't let this injustice go unchallenged. She was ready to fight, not just for her dignity, but for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. She wasn't just going to walk away anymore. Tamara walked through the doors of her apartment, kicking off her shoes as she entered. The silence of the space was heavy, almost suffocating. It mirrored the silence she felt every day, the unspoken weight of being a black woman in a predominantly white town. No matter how much she achieved, no matter how hard she worked, there was always an invisible wall keeping her just a little bit behind. She sank into the couch, staring blankly at the wall, her thoughts spinning. The encounter with Officer Matthews earlier that day had been more than just a rude interaction. It was a reflection of a lifetime of moments like that, moments where she was treated as though she didn't belong. She had spent years trying to overcome the sting of microaggressions, to rise above the small, constant reminders that the world saw her differently simply because of the color of her skin. But today, those years of effort felt like they had been erased in an instant. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table and she picked it up, seeing a text from Lena. "How are you holding up?" Tamara stared at the message for a moment before responding. "I'm fine, just tired." Lena knew her better than anyone. She could tell that Tamara wasn't fine, but Tamara wasn't ready to talk about it. Instead, she threw the phone on the couch beside her and buried her face in her hands. The weight of her life in this town had been overwhelming for so long. She had worked so hard to be seen as competent, to be recognized for her dedication to helping at-risk youth. Yet the world continued to remind her of the barriers she faced, barriers that were never truly addressed, no matter how much she tried to fight through them. In those moments of vulnerability, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just about Matthews. It wasn't about him or the few others who had treated her with contempt. It was the system. It was the culture that supported officers like him that made his actions not just possible, but accepted. Sitting up straight, she wiped her face and reached for her phone again. This time she called Lena. "Hey, what's going on?" Lena's voice crackled through the phone, filled with concern. "I had another run-in with Matthews," Tamara said, her voice tight. "It was worse than usual, Lena. Worse than I ever thought it could be." "Tamara, I'm so sorry," Lena said quietly. "But you've been strong through all this. You've got so much to offer. Don't let him get to you." Tamara's jaw tightened. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this," she admitted. "Every day it's the same. I work harder than anyone, and still, people like Matthews treat me like I don't belong. I try to keep going for the sake of the community, but how long can I keep fighting a battle that feels invisible? I feel like no one even cares." Lena was quiet for a moment. "You care, Tamara, and that's what matters." Tamara shook her head, feeling the weight of those words. "I've spent my entire life proving myself. I've spent so much energy trying to make my presence known, trying to be heard, but it's like the world keeps telling me I'm not enough." "That's the thing," Lena said, her voice growing stronger. "You are enough, and you're more than enough. You've got a purpose, Tamara. Maybe it's time you started using your voice to make change, Not just for yourself, but for everyone who's been silenced by the system. Tamara fell silent, the words hitting her harder than expected. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She had spent so long trying to navigate this world with grace, trying to prove herself worthy of space. But Lena was right. It was time for something bigger. She couldn't keep trying to fit into a mold that didn't fit her. The next morning, Tamara woke with a sense of clarity. She couldn't let this go on. She couldn't let Matthews or anyone like him continue to define her. This fight wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the entire community, about breaking the chains of systemic oppression that had held so many down for far too long. She walked into her office, sat at her desk, and pulled up the file on Officer Matthews. It was time to take action. Later that day, Tamara stood in front of the police department, a formal complaint in her hands. She felt the weight of it, the truth of what she was about to do, hold someone accountable for their actions. For too long she had been the one to apologize, to shrink back, to keep quiet in the face of injustice. But no more. She couldn't keep letting this slide. Not when the community was counting on her. Not when she had finally found her voice. She approached the desk, her eyes steady, her posture strong. "I need to file a complaint about Officer Matthews," she said, her voice firm. The officer behind the desk barely looked up. "What's the issue?" Tamara held her ground. "He treated me with disrespect during a routine stop yesterday. He assumed I didn't belong in this neighborhood, questioned my presence, and made derogatory comments about my right to be here." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Is that it? Is that all?" Tamara repeated, her voice growing louder now. "This isn't just about one interaction. This is about a culture of disrespect that runs deep in this department. Officer Matthews isn't the only one. But if we don't hold people like him accountable, nothing will ever change." The officer nodded, scribbling something down, but Tamara could feel the dismissiveness in his demeanor. "We'll look into it," he said flatly. "Don't just look into it," she snapped. "Do something about it. Make it right. Because I'm not going to stand by while people like Matthews continue to poison the community." Tamara turned and walked out, her resolve strengthening with every step. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the beginning. The sound of the city hummed in the distance as Tamara walked briskly to the youth center, her mind focused on the work ahead. The community she had dedicated herself to for years was always in need, and Tamara was determined to keep pushing forward, even as the weight of her own struggles seemed unbearable at times. She had grown used to being overlooked, to her contributions being dismissed as less important because of her race, but each day she rose again, until now. Today was different. The moment she saw the squad car pull up beside her, she felt her body tense. It wasn't the first time she had been stopped by Officer Matthews, but this time something inside her snapped. She had been asked 100 questions by him and others like him, questioned for simply existing in spaces they didn't think she had a right to be. But this time, her patience was gone. "Excuse me," Matthews's voice called out, filled with authority. Tamara kept walking, refusing to stop until the car's engine revved slightly, and he called out again. "Hey, I said excuse me!" She stopped and turned, her expression neutral but her body rigid, bracing herself. "Yes, officer?" "Where are you headed?" Matthews asked, his tone dripping with suspicion, as if her presence itself was a question that needed answering. "You don't seem like you belong here." Tamara's eyes narrowed, but she kept her voice calm. "I'm walking home from work, officer. I work at the youth center down the road." Matthews's gaze hardened, studying her. "Really? People like you don't typically work in places like that." Her stomach churned at the casual dismissal. "People like me." The phrase cut deeper than she cared to admit, but she wasn't going to let it show. "My work has nothing to do with where you think I belong," she said, the calmness of her voice betraying the storm raging inside her. "I live here. I belong here. And I'm not loitering, if that's what you're implying." He scoffed, rolling his eyes. "It's not about where you live, is it? It's about you thinking you're special enough to just walk through here. You're not." Tamara clenched her fists, trying to remain composed. Her whole life had been filled with moments like this, microaggressions that stacked up, moments where her very existence seemed like an affront to the world around her. But now, the weight of it all became unbearable. "I don't need to justify my existence to you, officer," she said, her voice steady but laced with a quiet fury. "I'm not doing anything wrong. Maybe you're just not used to seeing people like me in places like this." Matthew's eyes widened slightly, his smugness faltering. "Maybe you should just be careful about where you walk and who you talk to," he muttered, clearly done with the exchange. Tamara didn't respond, watching as he pulled away. She stood there, motionless for a moment, the air around her thick with the weight of everything she'd just endured. His words echoed in her mind. "People like you don't belong here." It wasn't just about him. It was about a system, a world that constantly reminded her of her place. And that place, it seemed, was always one step behind. As the squad car disappeared, she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She wasn't going to cry. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her broken. But as she walked home, the frustration began to build, and by the time she reached her apartment, the tears were impossible to stop. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and a persistent anger she couldn't seem to shake. She couldn't forget what Matthews had said to her, or how it felt to be dismissed. Just one more black person in a system that treated people like her as invisible. The weight of it was too much for anyone to carry alone. In the quiet of her apartment, Tamara finally picked up her phone and texted Lena. "I can't keep doing this." Lena's response came quickly. "You don't have to do this alone, Tamara, you know that." Tamara stared at the screen for a long time before typing back. "I'm tired of fighting, but maybe it's time to really make change. It's bigger than just me now." The next day, a call came. A civil rights group had heard about the incident. They wanted to meet. They wanted her to help. When she arrived, they explained their proposal. The city had recently formed a diversity board aimed at addressing police reform, and they wanted Tamara to be a part of it. The idea of having a direct line into the police force, of being able to fight from within, was something she never expected. And yet, the more they spoke, the more it felt like the opportunity of a lifetime, an opportunity to make real change. But as the conversation continued, doubt crept in. Could she really work alongside the very system that had dismissed her for so long? Would she be a pawn, or would she be able to make a difference? "I don't know if I'm ready," Tamara admitted, the weight of the decision sinking in. This is the system I've been fighting against. It's not just one officer. It's everything." The activist nodded, understanding. "I get it, but you've been fighting from the outside. What if this is your chance to be inside, to really make a change?" Tamara was silent for a moment, the weight of the question hanging in the air. Then, slowly, she nodded. "All right, I'll do it for them, for all of us." "Because I've lived it," she said calmly, her voice cutting through the tension. "And because change doesn't come from within your comfort zone. You can either work with us, or you can continue fighting against progress." Matthews smirked, but said nothing more, the tension lingering in the air. The meeting continued, with Tamara speaking up at every opportunity, presenting ideas for cultural competency training, better community engagement, and real steps to combat systemic racism. But it wasn't easy. Every suggestion she made was met with resistance, especially from Matthews, who consistently tried to undermine her credibility. Over the next few weeks, the resistance only grew. Matthews's jabs became more pointed, his dismissiveness more deliberate. Tamara found herself feeling the sting of each moment, but something inside her began to shift. She wasn't the same woman who had been humiliated on the streets by Matthews's disregard. She wasn't the same woman who had doubted herself in the quiet moments alone. Her frustration was building, yes, but so was her resolve. One day, during a department-wide meeting about new diversity policies, Matthews launched into a tirade against the suggestions Tamara had brought forward. His voice was loud and dismissive, mocking her ideas in front of the entire room. "So I've been doing just fine without these changes. What makes you think you can come in here and tell us what's broken?" he spat, looking directly at Tamara. The room went quiet. every eye turning to her. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for, the moment she had to prove that her voice mattered. Tamara's hand clenched at the table, but she didn't flinch. She stood, her voice clear and unwavering. "I think the issue here is that you don't see what's broken," she said, her tone firm and commanding. "You're so used to this system, this comfort of superiority, that you can't even see the damage it causes. You're dismissing real change because it makes you uncomfortable, but your discomfort is nothing compared to the lives that have been affected by this system." A murmur ran through the room. Matthews looked taken aback, caught off guard by the intensity in her voice. He opened his mouth to speak, but Tamara cut him off. "You don't get to silence me anymore," she continued, her voice steady with authority. "You don't get to question my place in this room. I'm not here because I need your approval. I'm here because this—" She gestured around the room. "This has to change." For a moment, there was silence. The weight of her words hung in the air, and Matthews stood there stunned. His power, which had been built on dismissing people like her, began to crumble. Slowly, other officers in the room began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. "I'm done waiting for things to change," Tamara said, her eyes never leaving Matthews. "I'm going to make them change, and if you don't like it, that's not my problem." The power dynamics in the room shifted in that moment. Matthews, who had once dismissed Tamara as a mere obstacle, now found himself facing the truth of her words. He wasn't just losing his battle against her, he was losing his grip on the outdated system he had spent his entire career upholding. Tamara's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't back down. She had found her voice, and now no one would silence her. Her transformation was complete. She was no longer just a social worker, quietly pushing for change. She was a leader, and this was only the beginning. As the meeting adjourned, Tamara took a deep breath, her resolve strengthened. She had taken the first step in dismantling the system that had worked against her, and now she was determined to lead the charge for real change. The journey ahead would be long, and there would be more battles to fight. But Tamara knew one thing. This fight was hers to win, and with every step she would continue to lead the way for those who had been silenced for far too long.